All right, well, it's 9 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to the League webinar on the home rule option or the permanent base adjustment. What we're going to talk about today is how both work, the pros and the cons of using both options, and we're going to start out with a history of why these came into existence altogether. So back in the 1979, 1980 timeframe, there was a movement in the country as to why, as to how the property tax and city and town expenditures were increasing, and how we were not able to keep up with that. And so in places like California, you started to see issues like Prop 13. And so what we had to do, what was necessary is for there to be some limits put on the property tax, and also they put actual spending limits on cities and towns in California. So the legislature in Arizona made it so that we would have two types of limits. There would be a primary property tax limit, which is 2% each year plus the value of new construction, and also that there was going to be an expenditure limit. It would take the 7980 spending of every city and town, and that would be calculated every year, taking that base year of 1979-80, and there would be inflation and population limits added to that, and that would be the new limit for the year. And that would be the expenditure limit of any city or town in the state. But they also knew, and this was one area where Arizona was a little more forward-thinking than some of the other Western states, and they decided to put something out to the people that said, along with these revenue and expenditure limits, we are going to give cities and towns and counties the opportunity to go to their voters and ask for an alternative, so that as changes were made to budgets and there were things that they were not contemplated in the budgets in the 79 and 80 time period. Maybe 20 years from now, there's a police and fire expenditures that weren't contemplated. Maybe there's technology costs that were not contemplated. And so it gave the citizens and the government an opportunity to make changes and to have an opportunity to set an alternative limitation with those issues in mind. And so both constitutionally and statutorily, we added several options, but the two that are used by far and away the most are the alternative expenditure limitation or home rule option and the permanent base adjustment. Before I go on, one of the things that I neglected to mention is that if you have questions, we prefer, instead of sending a chat message, you can send the message through the question and answer function that is part of the webinar software that you've downloaded. And then every once in a while, I'm going to stop my presentation and check to see if there are any questions. I'm going to do that quickly. I don't see any right now, so we'll just keep moving on with our budget, with our presentation. So the first of these expenditure limitations I'm going to talk about is the most popular, and that's the home rule option. The idea here is that you have the opportunity as a city or town to say, we're going to set our budget, our own budget, every year, free from any ties at all to the state expenditure limit. So it was not necessary for a city or town to sit down and look at their budget and then look at exemptions that might be provided in the state statute or any of those kinds of things. They just said, we're going to set our own budget. And so, but the framers of that initiative that set this all in motion said that the only way that this could happen is that the alternative limitation had to be voted on by or approved by 2/3 of the council members from the city, and also that they would need to have that go to a vote, and cities and towns would have to get approval from not only the council but also the voters of the city or town. So the process for doing this is, and one of the things that I want to mention is, when you are considering a home rule option or a permanent base adjustment, the league each year prepares a home rule option packet for those cities or towns who are trying to either re-up their current alternative limitation, whether it be the home rule option or the permanent base adjustment, or they're trying to put one in for the first time. So a lot of this information that I'm providing to you today is part of that packet. And we're going to refer to that packet as we go through the presentation. There are the requirements for the home rule option. Again, because they're giving you authority to basically set your budget each year, some of the requirements are a little more stringent than that of the permanent base adjustment. You have to hold 2 public hearings on the proposed action. Now, what kind of things have to be at those hearings? Well, you need to provide to the public the reason that you need to go after these home rule options. And again, one of the things that's important to remember is that these hearings, you can provide information about costs, about the budget, and why the home rule option may be necessary, but you have to be careful that you're not actually encouraging people to vote yes. You're simply providing them information wherewith they can make an informed decision. Notice of the hearings have to be published once a week for 2 consecutive weeks in a newspaper of general circulation in the city. That is right out of the state statute, and for a lot of the notices that we do, this just kind of follows suit. The next thing is you have to provide, there's a publicity pamphlet that goes out to the voters, and detailed information will be provided to the voters in that publicity pamphlet. So before that detailed information goes out to the public, it has to be provided to the Auditor General's office. And so in the packet that the league provides, there's places where you have to put information about your population, inflation factors, and then what costs you're going to have, and or what your expenditure limit is that the state has provided to you. And then that sets your expenditure limit for the year. But you also have to provide information about how much you expect your expenditures to be for the following 4 years. One of the questions that I get a lot about this is, do we have to stick to what's on what those estimates are that we provide after it's been approved? Do we have to follow exactly what we have provided in the publicity pamphlet? The fact of the matter is that no, you do not. Now, you still have to go through your budget process and set your budget as you would normally each year, but you can, you don't have to, those are not set in stone. Now, you want to, again, as you're going through the budget process, refer back to those and let the citizenry know why you're making those changes, but it's not necessary to stick to those. One of the recommendations that also that league staff would like to make to folks is that if you create the information, put the information together that you provide to the Auditor General's office, part of what we send out with your packet each year is a little spreadsheet that does the calculations for you. The Auditor General's office tells us that each year the biggest problem that they encounter is math problems. People not adding, subtracting, dividing correctly. And so we provided a simple calculation sheet for you to do that. And it has cut back in the first 2 years that we've used it. It's cut back a great deal on those types of issues. So I'm going to pause for a moment here and just check and see if we've had any questions sent in. Okay, I don't see any, so we'll move on to our next slide. As we mentioned, if the voters affirm the home rule option, then it is in place for 4 years. That means the voters have given you 4 years of authority to simply set your budget as you see fit, and following the procedures set out in statute for the adoption of your budget. Following the 4th year, you have to go back again and approve either another alternative expenditure limitation, or vote in a permanent base adjustment, or you may decide that you'll just use the state expenditure limit. That again is all up to the city, but after 4 years under the home rule option, you have to go back and do that. One of the things that is included in our packet, at the end of each packet, is we have the latest fiscal year in which you approved your last expenditure limit, whether it be the home rule option or the permanent base adjustment. Again, the year that you improved it and when you would have to go back to an election. Now, as we'll talk about with the permanent base adjustment, you don't need to go back to an election, so there's no listing about when you would have to go back for that one. However, with the home rule option, in one column, it tells you when you would have to have your next election. One of the important things to remember about the next election as well is that the election has to be held when you are electing council members. For the vast majority of cities and towns, that means you can hold your election in August or November of any even numbered year. And so you can make your choice as to when you want to do it in August or November. Now, that's a little bit different with the permanent base adjustment. Well, we'll talk about that as we move forward. But again, keep an eye out every year. One of the things that happens as well is I send this information out in October or November of the year in which you're going to have the elections, and people start looking for it in February or March, and I get a call, hey, I need to get the packet that you've prepared. I send the packet out to all the clerks and all the finance directors in that fall time frame every year. So make sure that you keep your eye out for it. And I also list in that publication, in that email that I send out, all of the cities and towns that I believe have to reapprove their home rule option. Okay, I'm going to do a quick check on questions. Okay, I don't see that we don't have any, so I'm going to keep moving. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about the permanent base adjustment. How is this different from the home rule option? The home rule option, again, is having authority to set your budget at whatever you would like it to be. Again, when we talk about the state expenditure limit, that is the base limit from which you are working. The permanent base adjustment then means that you are adding a specific dollar amount to your state expenditure limit that's created every year, and then they take that amount and adjust it for inflation and population. So again, to illustrate with some numbers, let's say that you had a $10 million budget, and your state expenditure limit was $7 million. But you know, going forward in the future that you're going to need to have that an extra amount. So you set a permanent base amount of $5 million. And so that $5 million is what goes out to the voters. And again, each year that $7 million state expenditure limit is going to grow. You will add the $5 million to it and then adjust it for inflation and population. And so you'll have a new expenditure limit every year. It's interesting to note that the Auditor General's office puts out a listing of all those folks that have the state expenditure limit in place. They actually include those cities and towns that have a permanent base adjustment with those that are under the state expenditure limit, because they consider, even though you have created a base limit that you add to it, they still consider you under the state expenditure limit. Those that have the home rule option are not a part of that list. Really doesn't mean anything as far as your day-to-day operations, but it's just an interesting thing that the Auditor General's office does. So this is again, the idea here is that I have expenditures that were not contemplated in 7980. And so I am trying to get a dollar amount that I can fix each year that will take care of those new expenditures, and then the population and inflation will move me into the future. What's really important with the permanent base adjustment is that figuring out that base amount. I get a lot of questions about, well, how exactly do I do that? How do I figure out how much I need to make an adjustment that will work for me going into the future, so that I can take advantage of the one big flexibility that's provided by the permanent base adjustment, and that is not having to go back to an election. It doesn't do me any good if in 4 years that amount that I've added to the top doesn't work for me anymore. So we have not developed a methodology, but there are cities and towns that have. And if you have questions about how to do that, we can refer you to people who can help you to know how much you should set that permanent base amount to be. All right, I'm going to check the questions quickly here. All right, I don't see any, so we're going to move to the next slide. Okay, again, in order to get, this has to go to the voters, and it has to be by a vote of 2/3 of the members of the city or town council, and then it has to go to the qualified electors. Now, again, here, the same rules apply as far as that there's 2/3 of the members of the city council and the qualified electors, but there's no public hearings that have to be held on this process. Detailed information has to be provided, but it's not quite as substantial as what you have to provide for the home rule option. Basically, the reason for that is a permanent base adjustment is just an increase to the expenditure limit, but it's not giving you authority to just set your budget. This base amount is when you give information to the Auditor General's office about how you've come to it, in the mind of the people who put together the initiative, they were giving much more authority to people to just set their budgets, and that's why they put in the added caution of having to have an election every 4 years. And so again, they don't see the permanent base adjustment as quite as giving you as much authority as what they give you for the home rule option. All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, an approved permanent base adjustment will be used again in determining what your base limit is for each year. Now again, in the packet that's sent out, there's a packet sent out to cities and towns every year from the Auditor General's office, and what that packet contains is the expenditure limits for all cities and towns. Now, for a city or town that has the home rule option, that doesn't apply. So the only cities and towns that are listed on that list from the Auditor General's office is those cities or towns that have no alternative limit, and they're using the state expenditure limit for their budgeting, or those cities and towns that have adopted a permanent base adjustment, because they do also have an expenditure limit. Home rule option cities and towns don't have a limit. They're basically just setting their budget. So you have those with a permanent base adjustment get that expenditure limitation information from the Auditor General's office, and then they use that to begin their budgeting. Cities and towns have that sent to them by the Auditor General's office, but we at the League also send that information out just to make sure that there isn't anybody that's missed. We work very closely with the Auditor General's office to make sure that everybody has all the information and that they need in order to have this go off the way it should and on time. I'm going to take a little break here and talk a little bit about why this is so important. We have had a couple of cities over the years that have, because of turnover in staff or for other reasons, they have neglected to put the information out that they needed to create notice and everything, that they needed to re-up their home rule option, or that they wanted to do a permanent base adjustment at their election. And therefore, they have to work under the state expenditure limit. What happens with those cities is that they have to cut back in that 1 year significantly on their budget. And then they normally, in order to get back to regular spending, they will have to have a couple of elections in a row that are called one-time limitations. And that is a very difficult process to have to go through. It takes a lot of explaining to the citizens. It's kind of an embarrassing thing to have happen. So you need to make sure that if you're in a position as a finance director, or if you're a clerk that has finance responsibility and elections responsibility, that you're on top of when your next election has to happen, okay? All right, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so we have, here I want to talk about the pros and the cons of each of these options. And you can see here we're going to talk about election date options. We're going to talk about the permanent versus the 4-year renewals and flexibility. I'm going to stop and just check and see if there's any questions. Okay, we're going to move right into it then. All right, so I put on this slide, you can see the actual language that is listed here. It says that for the nomination or election of the members of the governing board of such political subdivisions. So these have to be held, both of these have to be held when you're having an election of the members of your governing board. And again, for most cities and towns, that's going to be in the fall of even-numbered years. Move on to the next slide. Now, the one option that does exist also under the permanent base adjustment is that you can have it during a regularly scheduled state general election. So if you are a charter city and you are not having an election because you have yours in the spring, or you have yours in an odd year, then you can choose to be part of a regularly scheduled state general election, and whether or not you are voting people in. So there is some flexibility if there is a reason that you need to get something in right away, it can be held during that time. But that option only exists from the permanent base adjustment. So again, home rule option, you have to have your election when you are voting in members of your board. Now, some people have asked me, does that mean if I have an election and all the of my council members and my mayor are all voted in the primary, does that mean I can't schedule one for the fall? Well, the fact of the matter is you have to have that information to the county ahead of time, and there's always the possibility of a runoff. And so since there's the possibility, you can schedule it in either time frame, either in the August election or the November election. The fact of the matter is that it has to be when you're holding that. So the only time that there's any kind of choice is when you're a charter city and you hold your election on dates other than the fall of even numbered years. All right, I'm going to check and see if there's any questions on that. Okay, not seeing any. We're going to move on then to permanent versus 4-year renewals. Okay. The great thing about a permanent base adjustment is that if you set it correctly, you may never need to go back for an election again. I live in the town of Gilbert, and they set theirs clear back when I first came to the state. I believe they set theirs in 1998. And so they haven't had to go back to an election at all during that time period. And they spent quite a bit of time talking about how to set their adjustment so that they need not ever go back. And again, I refer several people to the finance person who was in charge of Gilbert at the time, was George Pettit. George is no longer working for the town, but he still graciously takes phone calls to tell people the process that they went through to come to a decision. And the one thing, though, you can set that aside as a pro. The con, however, is that when you are talking to the voters, voters aren't involved with this kind of information every day. And so they don't always get that. They understand I'm giving you 4 years, in the case of the home rule option, I'm giving you 4 years to set your budget. And at the end of 4 years, if I don't like what you've done, I'm simply not going to renew the home rule option. Describing the permanent base adjustment takes a little more doing. It takes a lot of voter education. And so this is, if you are considering moving from a home rule option to a permanent base adjustment, it's our recommendation that you take some time, have your finance director and your other people put together how they arrived at the number that they did, talk about the expenditures that are causing you to exceed your current state expenditure limit, and talk to them about why you think that this is a good idea. Cities and towns that have moved from a home rule option to a permanent base adjustment, some of them have told us they've heard from their businesses, for example, or certain very informed citizens, why do we have to go back again to another election? These elections, have passed since 1980. We haven't had one go down. Why are we going to the expense of having an election for this or putting this on the ballot? And that's a really good question. And so again, if you can get the everyday citizens to understand that, that is a really good reason to move to a permanent base adjustment. Now, the one thing that we always tell city staff, it is very important to have council members who can, on their own, they can't speak on behalf of the council, but they can, on their own as a citizen, they can encourage people to vote and talk to them about why they think it's important. They just can't speak on behalf of the council. So it's very important to have them be a part of the education process of the citizens if you're going to go out and talk about a permanent base adjustment. Okay. All right, let's check and see if there's any questions on that. Okay, there's not. So let's move to, okay, home rule option. Again, there's a downside to the 4-year renewal cycle. Every year I feel for those cities and towns that have to go out and do this. Most of the time, in lots of communities, it is, you know, basically a foregone conclusion. I've seen, you know, when you get a 70-30, 80-20 vote count on that, you can feel pretty good as a city. But there are those communities where they are biting their nails and they are counting their votes and they're staying up late watching the returns when they go to those elections. That there's a downside to that. So, but it is an easy thing, again, to explain to the voters, as I already mentioned. They understand that they'll be part of the budget process that you're having every year. They will still have input, but you will have sufficient resources. It will allow you to spend the money that you have for those expenditures. That's another thing I want to stop and just clarify right now too. One of the biggest misconceptions about these alternatives, both the permanent base adjustment and the home rule option, is that this is not authority to capture more revenue or to increase taxes. This is authority to spend those monies that you have. The vast majority of cities and towns have more revenues coming in than they're allowed to spend in their with their state expenditure limit. So this is something, again, that needs to be explained to the voters in either limitation. But in those areas where, in those cities where there may be a political difficulty concerning the city's expenditures or their budgets, home rule option seems to be a better way to go. They can get behind that because they know that at the end of 4 years, they can put a stop to it. And those 4 years, again, it's no mystery to understand. Those 4 years also coincide with 4-year terms of city and town council members and mayors. Okay. Any questions about that I can answer? Not seeing any. All right, let's move to the next one. Flexibility. Again, we've talked about the reasons, but we consider the home rule option to be more flexible because you're just adopting your budget every year. You don't have to anticipate any huge change that might come along because you can simply just have that added as part of your budget process. You don't need to know the expenditure limits exemptions intimately. Let me stop and explain what the expenditure limit exemptions are. In the state constitution, when they were putting all of this together, there was a set of exemptions, 13 to be exact, that were included in the state constitution. And these were meant that you could go back and say, okay, this expenditure is listed in the Constitution, and they say that I can exempt that from my expenditure limit. And so, or it can be, since it doesn't have to be added on, my state expenditure limit can go further. That has to do with certain HERF expenditures. It has to do with bond proceeds, principal and interest. It has to do with grants that you may receive from the federal government. There's a number of them there. There are certain very large cities and some small cities that actually don't use either of these limitations because they've gotten very good at using the state expenditure limits or the limit exemptions. And so that may be something that you want to take a look at as well. And so any kind of surprises plus the expenditure limit exemptions, they don't have to worry about any of those. And so any kind of budget surprises are easier to deal with. Those that use the permanent base adjustment have to get to know those exemptions because they become very important. They become important in what you set your base adjustment amount to be, and they become important because that's the kind of expectations that the citizens have is that you're going to use everything at your disposal before you set that amount. Very, very difficult to explain. So anyway, we believe that there's a great amount of flexibility with the home rule option. But if you can explain the permanent base adjustment and you can become comfortable with the exemptions that are provided in state statute, it can become something where you don't have to hassle with an election every year. All right, that is the end of my presentation. I would be happy to answer any questions that anyone would have. We'll pause here and give you a chance to use the question options if you need to. I just want to thank everybody again. This is a work in progress, but we thought that this was a good way to not to have all of you travel down to get this kind of information. We hope that you'll participate. We have a series of other information that we're going to provide, and we hope that you'll join us for that. We're going to talk about property taxes and a number of other finance issues. There's one question that did pop up. Let me open that up. Okay, there was a question that says, can you return to the home rule after adopting a permanent base adjustment? The answer to that is yes. Again, once you can do a number of things. If you have a permanent base adjustment in place, and let's say that amount that you decided to put forward isn't enough, and after a number of years it isn't sufficient anymore, you have two options. You can adopt the home rule once again, or you can go back and put another base adjustment in front of the voters. So both of those things are available to you. That's a very good question. Any others that I can answer? All right, we'll give another minute here just to see if we have any other questions. All right, well, thank you for joining. I hope that this was informative, and Matt Lohr from our office will be sending out more information about the following mini sessions that we're going to be doing. We'd love to hear how you thought this went, and if it was worth your time on a Friday morning. Thanks again, everybody, for joining, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.